Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Rose City Politics. It is the 26th of January, 2022. In case you forgot, our regular panel tonight includes Doug Sartori. Doug, how you doing?
Doing great.
Loving the background. We won't talk about it right now. It'll come up later on, most likely.
Save it.
Organically. We've got Don Merrifield Jr. coming from The Void, still carrying through to this year. How you doing and how is it?
Things are good, a little bit chilly, but that's just my life.
That's just the void. There is a cold which emanates straight through.
It's
constantly.
A cold blank emptiness that is my life, John.
I am John Lidke. We are glad to have all of you here tonight. Special episode. We are on Ward Watch 2022. This is episode 4. Obviously, we are talking Ward 9. No, it's Ward 4. Doing some pretty bad jokes tonight, though, to get through. These get monotonous. We're not talking any current events. I try to find a way to peg them in, but we never get a chance to. But if you're listening right now and you are a Patreon subscriber, thank you so much. If you're not, head over to patreon.com/Rose City Politics. And while you're on the web, why don't you head to bizxmagazine.com to any one of your favorite social media or podcasting apps, because that is where we are. And Rose City Politics is able to broadcast live on tape thanks to the kind support of Leuna 625, building better communities. Again, as I said, we are on Ward 4. There is not much to discuss about it other than just diving straight in. We will have Doug do a little bit of table setting for us about the demographics of the ward, some statistics about the ward. I think we'll talk a little bit about what the ward looks like now and then we'll dive into a little bit of some conversation about it. So without further ado, Doug, why don't you take it away right now?
Sure thing. Thanks, John. And as you alluded to in your introduction, I think one of the things that we should do, we've been talking for weeks about the election results going back to 1991 and making reference to the old ward system, the old 5-ward system. But if you're like me, you don't have any memory of what those ward boundaries looked like. So I pulled up a map. You can find this map on the City of Windsor website. If you Google Windsor Old Wards, you will find it. But if you're watching us on YouTube, you should be seeing the ward map right now. Today, we're talking about Ward 4. So Ward 4 in the old system didn't start. Its westernmost boundary was Walker Road, and its east boundary was Jefferson. So in the context of what we would consider to be Ward 4 today, the 10-ward system, Ward 4, virtually none of it, if any, would be in the old Ward 4. So I shared that at the outset by way of explanation, because as we get into the election results, some of these numbers are going to sound awfully familiar to you. So going back to 1991, the old Ward 3, in case you missed the show last week, the winner in 1991 was Donna Gamble. Tom Porter was second. Donna Gamble won again in 94. Fulvio Valentinis was second. Remember, in the old system, second place got a seat. In 1997, the duo of Fulvio Valentinis and Alan Halberstadt were elected. So if you want to think about Ward 4 in its modern context, that would be the start of the modern political era in Ward 4 with the election of Alan Halberstadt, a position that he continued to hold until 2014. In 2000, again, Fulvio and Allen. 2006, Fulvio and Allen. Now, 2010, the beginning of the 10-ward system, Alan Halberstadt was your winner, 3,164 votes. Tony Black, a perennial candidate, did fairly well in some elections, came in second this time, 1,617 votes. 2014, Chris Holt took the crown of Ward 4, beating Adriano Sciotoli by less than 300 votes. And I think it's really important to remember that 2014 Ward 4 field was just wild. It was absolutely stacked with names. Lots of people who are prominent in our community took their shot at running for municipal office in 2014. The votes went every which way. As you can see from the result, Chris Holt got 1,812. In 2018, the race was not like that. It was a two-way race. We had Chris Holt defending his seat against newcomer Janice Campbell. Chris got 4,407 votes, good for 79% of the vote, roughly. Janice Campbell came in second, got 1,138 votes. Moving into the demography of Ward 4, total population in 2011 was 23,392. In 2016, that grew to 23,757. The average population density per square kilometer is 3,765 people. For comparison, Ward 3, 5,749. Ward 2, 3,462. So definitely an urban ward, but not quite as densely populated as the downtown core. 21% of the population under 19, 14% over 65. So a significant number of youth in Ward 4, and relatively, compared to neighboring wards, a relatively small number of seniors. 1,760 single parent families, 82% of them led by women. The median income in Ward 4 in 2016 was 26,990. After tax average income, 31,242, which is a little bit lower than the Ward 5 numbers, but those numbers are significantly higher than what you would see in Ward 2 or Ward 3. So an urban ward, certainly a little bit more affluent than the wards to the west. The low income rate is 28.78%. So there are certainly significant pockets of poverty in Ward 4. In fact, 19.4% of the population is in the bottom income decile, the bottom 10% of income earners. Comparing that to Wards 2 and 3, both of those are over 30% in the bottom income decile. 5% of the population is in the top income decile, which is double the percentage of the population that achieves that level of income in Ward 3. 7% of Ward 4 residents use transit to reach employment. And we don't have the top industries of employment in Ward 4. So we'll just make something up. I'm going to say that it's lattes. That's it. Latte making is the top.
It was either that or
maker.
cocaine distribution. I wasn't sure which two we should go
That's
with.
number 2. That's number
Is it?
2.
Okay,
There
I
we
thought
go.
so.
Okay. So that's all joking aside. These numbers come to us from the Canadian Census by Statistics Canada by way of the hard work of friend of the show, Fraser Fathers, in his Know Your Ward series on ginger politics. We did get word from Fraser that he will be reviving the Know Your Ward series with the new census data that is coming imminently. So we hope to have some updated numbers for you very soon. And that's my report, Jonathan.
Thank you for that, Douglas. Let me ask you some questions. What stands out for you here? What's the biggest standout?
One thing that I think is really interesting about both Wards 3 and Ward 4 is the political stability. Once someone achieves incumbency in those wards, it seems very, very difficult to dislodge them, and look at the political careers of Fulvio Valentinus and Alan Halberstadt, and in many ways they are mirror images of one another in terms of their time on council. Both of them got the seat, and then they held the seat and held the seat and held the seat. Very different from the more sort of kaleidoscopic election results that we saw in Ward 2. I think that comes down to it comes down to some of the things that we've talked about in recent episodes in terms of the political makeup of different wards. And I think that, first of all, you have to narrow down the population of these wards into the folks who are the most likely to vote, because the highest voter turnout polls are going to be have an outsized influence on the outcome in that ward. And in both Ward 3 and in Ward 4, there are pockets of affluence which typically will correspond to the higher turnout areas. And in those polls end up having a major influence on the outcome of the election in the ward. So it's interesting to think about. You might expect that wards that have such a high levels of poverty and population in great difficulty in many places in the wards. It's somewhat surprising to see who gets elected and what issues are the top of mind issues for the electorate. I would suggest to you, while both Councillor Bordelin and Councillor Holt are progressive and have a lot to say about equity and social justice, I would, especially in the case of Chris Holt, I think that his interests are a little bit different. And which is not, again, not to say that he's not interested in social justice or not interested in alleviating the poverty in his ward. I'm not saying that at all, but I do think that you can see, especially from Chris Holt, that the concerns that his affluent urban residents have are also the concerns that drive Mr. Holt. And I don't think that's because he's some politically conniving meanie. I think it's because the people of Ward 4 who are politically engaged elected somebody who thinks a lot like they do and shares their views on the issues that matter most. And I think a difference from Ward 3, Councillor Bordelin has to deal with social issues because the neighborhoods are a lot more blended in Ward 3. And I'm interested if Don sees it the same way, but I think that the pockets of affluence in Ward 3 are smaller and they're more embedded in neighborhoods that contain challenges. And there's a little bit more of a mixed income neighborhoods. I think that happens more in Ward 3 than it does in Ward 4. In Ward 4, I don't have stats in front of me, but Don, if you had to guess, what parts of Ward 4 are overrepresented in terms of concentration of poverty, and what parts of Ward 4 have those top 10% of income earners?
Well, your traditional Walkerville homes are going to be your high income people. That's pretty obvious in Ward 4. Riverside Drive, they really don't have a lot because there's a lot of commercial stuff on Riverside Drive in Ward 4. Your lower income areas obviously going to be kind of let me think, north of Wyandotte and probably west of, probably once you get around Hall, Pierre Street, Gladstone, that area. So once you get kind of closer to the casino, I guess would be the best way to describe it. You hit kind of quite low income, a lot of renters over there. So you're going to be running into more lower income stuff there. And even as you get closer to the downtown, your Goyo streets and Mercer streets and those kind of roads. But definitely, yeah, where the quote unquote rich people are is old Walkerville. I mean, anywhere from, well, even in the old Walkerville area, you can go right up to Riverside Drive, but traditionally it'd be like Wyandotte all the way over to Richmond or even Ottawa Street. And obviously from Walker Road to about Gladstone or Lincoln, there's going to be a lot of, everything there. Price range for housing is going to be $500,000 plus, the majority of it.
Would you agree with my perspective that neighborhoods in Ward 3 are a little bit more blended?
Yeah, because if you look in Ward 3, they're really only, very concentrated area of higher income earners would probably be Victoria Avenue. That would be one of your higher end streets in this area. I live down here. I don't live on Victoria, but I can see the rich people from my window. And And then you also in Ward 3, you'll get people who live on Riverside Drive, especially the condos. You look at the Portofino condo, that's, generally, again, $500,000. So you're gonna have to be at a certain income level to buy those, or anywhere along, that stretch between the university kind of and going up to about Oak or Elm Street. There's a lot of nice houses there, and especially a lot of new ones that have been built. Some of the older ones torn down. So those would be your affluent areas. But generally, once you get into like, Bruce Church, Dougal, going the other way, Jeanette, and then you head over to like McKay Streets, and it's a pretty blended population. Even my street here, I don't like telling everybody where I live, but I can just tell by my neighbors. Some people, are doing fine, and some people, there's some renters here that you can tell they're a little bit more lower income. So yeah, it's more blended as opposed to Ward 4, where there's no poor people in Old Walkerville. That's just the reality of it. And it's very a lot more sectioned off in Ward 4.
Yeah, and we were talking in our pre-show chat. Thanks very much, Don. I appreciate that. We were talking in our pre-show chat about this particular issue, and in some ways, you can look at Ward 4 as a bit of a microcosm of the city. There is there's a have-not area and there's a haves area. And I think my perception is that the haves kind of dictate to the have-nots in Ward 4 in terms of what's on the agenda. Again, I am not trying to say that anybody who's active in Ward 4 doesn't care about poverty or doesn't attend to social issues. I'm not saying that at all. I just think that the folks whose votes are more likely to end up being cast on election day are a little bit more insulated from those issues than happens in Ward 3.
And Ward 4, I mean, if you keep going further south Walkerville as well, you're talking from Howard through to Walker, from Ypres as well. So there's multiple pockets throughout Ward 4 that, I mean, you only need 2,000 votes. And if you can get 2,000 votes, right, you're pretty well looking at getting elected. And in Ward 4, Doug, I think, the hypothesis seems to play out because of those concentrations and their overrepresentation of, those who typically wouldn't be the ones voting.
Yeah, I think there's a big difference though. Ward 4 is actually a high turnout ward. If you, when you think about the risk game of Windsor and what wards would be a higher priority for citywide races, Ward 4 is in the conversation. I would say 1, 6, 7, 4, maybe reverse 7 and 4 in order. So there's a big difference there. Ward 4 turns out, and I think in a contest like 2014, where you have a super divided race with lots of people who have name recognition and a bit of currency in the community. Chris Holt won with 1,800 votes in 2014. 1,800 votes is enough to make you a serious contender in any election year in Ward 2. So there is a bit of a difference. The voter universe in Ward 4 is bigger, even if it is geographically concentrated. And you do have to have, I think, a bit more of a following than you do in Ward 2. In Ward 2, we talked about this, anybody who can get 1,500 votes is dangerous in Ward 2. I wouldn't say the same of Ward 4. In fact, Janice Campbell was knocking on the door of that with almost 1,200 votes in 2018, and she wasn't a factor in any way.
Yeah, and I was just looking at the map, but John's right. If another demographic would be certainly South Walkerville, once you get over by the park there's a lot of higher income people living over there too. And then the closer you get to Tecumseh Road, the houses get smaller. So the two main areas would certainly be South Walkerville, like pretty much from Ypres, the other side, and then Old Walkerville. One thing that was interested in those stats you were saying is if you follow the transit debate that is never ending in this city, a lot of advocates for transit and even bike lanes and that kind of stuff, anecdotally, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but it just feels like a lot of those people are Walkerville type people. But then when you look at your stats here, there's only 7% of the people actually using transit. And even with the high rate of younger people under 19 there, it's a little surprising to me that more people in that area aren't using transit, because really that would be almost one of the easiest areas to use transit.
Yeah, so for comparison, 7.2% in Ward 4. The high for Windsor is Ward 2 with 12%. So wards 2, 3, 4, and 5 all have a pretty hefty population of transit users comparatively. But you're right, it is still only 7% that use public transit to reach employment. So one thing that number doesn't include is folks who use public transit to get to school. And I would suggest that the urban wards, especially like once you get past Ward 3, if you live in Ward 4 or 5, and you're a university student, you may well be taking transit, but you wouldn't appear in that statistic.
Yeah, that's true. And a lot of people who traditionally live in the old Walkerville spot stay in the old Walkerville spot because you kind of have everything you want right there. If you want quote unquote nightlife and, go to a pub or a restaurant, you got Wyandotte Street, so you don't have to go downtown, or you don't have to go to, another part of town. And same with the schooling there, because of the way that old Walkerville was originally developed and built. It was meant to be a walkable area because they didn't have cars when it was built. They were using horses and just walking. So yeah, just the nature of the actual fact that it was built so long ago is going to make it easier for people, not to use cars and not have to use transit either. But again, I think it's more, personally, I think it's more of an income thing. The higher income areas, they just, I mean, the numbers show it, don't use transit as much because they don't have to.
For sure. Well, hey, thanks again, Doug, for helping to explain a little bit of this. There's been some, obviously controversies and accomplishments that have panned out over the past term. One of them that you can look towards is the difference in how alleys have been treated, from bulk item pickup to the creation of a maintenance fund and to lighting that is in Via Italia and soon to be in Ottawa Street. I know, Don, you're one that has always spoken about the need for lighting in alleys. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, as far as the alleys go, alleys are an interesting situation, and this is going to go completely off topic. But we also heard our friend of the show, Fraser Fathers, and Sarah Sipkar working on, auxiliary unit, or I don't know what the proper name is, but basically alley houses. And
alternative dwelling units.
Alternative, yeah, that's what it was. ADUs. All right, thanks, John. And
it's a do, excuse me.
It's a do, yes, may we. So it's for our French listeners and people that know I was bilingual. So it's going to be interesting from a city standpoint if we start getting that kind of development. Tying this back into the alley situation, is they're going to have to start maintaining alleys. They're going to have to start making sure there is lighting back there. They're going to have to make sure that, they're even have to fix them. I mean, I have an alley behind my house, and they've never done anything back there. Just kind of, it is what it is, and whatever happens to it, happens to it. So yeah, alleys in Ward 3, in Ward 2 on some level too. Definitely in Ward 4 is going to be an issue because they're still used. They're used for garbage pickup, and yeah, lighting's an issue back there. I have a lot of friends who actually do live in the old Walkerville area, and there's crime issues there too with people skulking about in the alleys. And yeah, so when just the basic of lighting is a big topic, and alleys have kind of been neglected by the city, and obviously for years they've been trying to get rid of them. And other wards and other areas of the city, they've been selling them off to homeowners because they just close them down. There's really no use for them. But I think in more of the urban wards, you kind of have to keep them around because it's not logistically feasible to close them down because a lot of people have parking back there and stuff.
Now, staying on this topic, I had asked on social media what people thought some of the big issues were, and in relation to what you were just talking about there, unaffordable housing and Ward 4 being a traditionally starter neighborhood, and how people are being priced out of it. So, I mean, looking further, I guess, into that role, not only of, what ADUs could be, but the situation that we're in. And, we can try to wrap this up as well with, the mega hospital and taking away of the hospital that's there. There's going to be some new lands. I mean, where do you see Ward for a couple years from now, 5 years from now?
Well, if the question is about property values and things like that, I don't necessarily agree that people are being priced out of the ward. I think they're being priced out of the areas they want to be in. Obviously, the old Walkerville area prices have escalated quite a bit. Same with South Walkerville, but they were always high relative to the rest of the city. Monmouth and streets like that have gone up, and Argyle and the one behind it there, I can't think of it right now. They've gone up a lot relative to what they were before. So maybe on a percentage basis, yes. But I think once you get into more my son lives on Langlois by Giles. So in his area, Langlois, Pierre Hall, all those streets there, they're still, look, I understand across the board, affordability is an issue. I don't think this is a Ward 4 specific issue any more than it would be in most of the other wards, just because it was always a little bit higher than, if you were buying a house on the West End or even in Ward 2. It's yes and no. I understand what people are saying. The areas they hope they would live in one day, they can't afford, and I get that.
Yeah, so I want to dig into this a little bit, Don. What is it that do you think that makes it so difficult? If it is difficult, but I think it is, I'm leading it that way, makes it so difficult for some of the neighborhoods that are less affluent in Ward 4? What makes it so difficult for them to recover? Just looking at a map, you look at the areas that are north of Wyandotte Street, between say, Olette and take your pick in Walkerville, before you get to Old Walkerville, you get into that area. It seems to me like just from location, there's a lot of potential there and there's a lot of possibilities. But I lived in that neighborhood 30 years ago, and when I drive by or walk near it these days, it doesn't seem like much has changed in terms of the quality of the housing stock and the upkeep on the housing stock. And what do you think it takes to turn those neighborhoods around? Is it just time? Is it just people getting priced out of the next street over and starting to improve streets street by street?
Yeah, I had this conversation a few times when we've had Councillor Bordelon on, and even before he was a councillor, talking about how real estate agents are ruining downtown because they won't sell people houses downtown. And what I explained to him at the time, and it's a double-edged sword. The best thing that's happened in neighborhoods like mine, or some of what would have been traditionally the lower income neighborhoods, is prices have escalated exponentially higher. So what would happen? Let's go back 4 or 5 years before prices doubled. An area like mine wouldn't have been a first selection for someone. Let's just say you're a young couple with a kid or something. Traditionally, you tried to get into Riverside, you tried to get into South Windsor, especially if you were starting a family. If you were single or something, that's a different story. And then they got priced out of those neighborhoods. So what happens then is, it flows down. Well, what would be your second choice for a neighborhood? So the second choice would have, obviously Old Walkerville would have been in there too, but they can't afford that either. So second choice would have been more the east side of Olette, your Peary Hall, those kind of streets. But again, kind of stopping at Wyandotte, just because once you get north of Wyandotte, it gets a little sketchy, would be, I guess, the term to use. So what will help those areas? And it's happening a little bit. It's not a lot, but you're starting to see, even in the West End, which again, traditionally people that if you were ranking where they wanted to live, from a person buying a home and moving, that would have been very it was very common for me to hear clients say, I can afford to spend X number of dollars and I'm good with being anywhere except the West End. That was just what they would say. Happened all the time. Don't even send me houses in that area. And I got it. That was just the situation. And that's, it's not my job to tell people where to live. So now that we've had the escalation in prices like we've had, I think areas like mine, where I am, the last year or two, prices have started escalating because, 2 years ago, you could still buy a house like mine, which is just a traditional 2-story old downtown house with a big front covered porch. You've all seen them a million times because there's thousands of them. You could have got that in the 3 to 350 range, a couple of years ago. Now they're 450. Some really nice ones that have been refinished are going for over 500. So that's what happens in neighborhoods. You get, just out of pure economic reasons, you get people who, again, would have wanted to live in Riverside or wanted to live in South Windsor, can't afford it. So they go, well, what are my options from what can I afford and where can I afford to live? Well, you can afford to live on the West End. Okay, but I don't want to go there. Well, you can afford to live downtown, and maybe it's not, ideal what you want, but you're kind of closer to Victoria. So there are some nice areas. You're kind of skirting them. And even in Ward 4, it's been a running joke for years now in the real estate world is when people advertise houses, everything is Walkerville now. We'll make a joke, like someone will list a house on Goyu Street and say, oh, it's it's West Walkerville, because just that name having Walkerville in it has always been a good marketing thing. And so a friend of mine, the Drakeages, who is Mike Drakeage, who's in real estate, he's grown up in Walkerville, lives in Walkerville, and is a very adamant Walkerville is only this block, this block, this block, this block, this block. And he used to make fun of me because I would list the house on Gladstone and say it was Walkerville. So that area actually has expanded out. So as you've gone, this is again inside, but Lincoln, Gladstone, those kind of streets are now, people who would have bought in Windermere are now buying on those streets because it's close enough and I can afford it. So the area you're speaking about, kind of north of Wyandotte, has had a similar reputation as West Windsor would have had. A lot of rentals, crime problems. And so that, unfortunately, it's almost like Remington Park a little bit is another area. Those are kind of the last areas that property values will go up and incomes will go up, just because we haven't hit that point yet where you can't afford to buy a house downtown or close to Walkerville and in our new West Walkerville jokes that we always make. And same as South Walkerville. So Walkerville, the same thing. People would have filled that area up first before coming downtown, and that's kind of happened. So it's really, it's economics, it's gentrification is a problem. Unless you've bought a house 10 years ago and your investment is quadrupled, so you're happy. So it's it's a double-edged sword, but that's realistically, that's the only way you're going to see that area increase a lot, is if all the other areas keep increasing and people just can't afford to live there.
Yeah. Okay. So one follow-up, I want to just kind of build on that, and the question is,
it was the Remington Park stuff, wasn't it? That's what you're
it's funny
about.
you're listing all the sketchy neighborhoods and I'm thinking I lived in that one. Okay. That aside, so if Ward 4 is, and what I'm hearing from you is that Ward 4 is seeing that the more desirable neighborhood, quote unquote, Walkerville, its boundaries are expanding. Folks who used to live or used to buy a house on Windermere now buy a house on Gladstone, et cetera, et cetera. It raises the question of affordability. And I think this is a topic that would fit on any show, but it's worth talking about here. When I lived in Glengarry Marintet, I did it for one reason only, because it was a highly affordable rental unit. It was well within my means to live there. And I would imagine that's what drives a lot of folks to live in that neighborhood. So what happens, for example, to the folks who used to rent a home on Gladstone if it got sold and is now somebody's primary residence and who owns it and has the mortgage? What happens to them? Where are they going now, and what is it doing to rental rates in the areas that still are lower income or lower rents, however you want to describe it?
Yeah, I mean, it's a problem. Let's not kid ourselves. We've talked about the housing issue in Windsor. Excuse me, because even your houses, close to Tuscarora and places like that, those are flipping. People are, investors generally bought those anyway. The scenario you're describing wasn't as common probably on, as you got closer to traditional old Walkerville, because most of those people were living there because it was a desirable area. So there wasn't a ton of rentals there, aside from obviously the apartment buildings that were there. So yeah, if you're getting priced out of kind of north of Wyandotte, Tuscarora area, you got a problem, because there really at this point aren't any lower priced areas. Even the West End. I mean, I just sold a house on Bridge Street, which traditionally would have been, quite a low income rental type property. And, I can't disclose how much it went for, but it went for a lot more than I paid for my house years ago, and probably a lot more than my house would have costed you 4 years ago. So it like I say, it just keeps pushing out as far as you can go. And eventually you do hit critical mass. And I think we're getting close to that. I think that's why we're having, the housing discussions we are having, because, gentrification is great for people who already live in the area with housing values going up. But as you mentioned, if you get squeezed out of a rental on, Tuscarora and Pierre Street, and you need to find something else because they've flipped it and, evicted everybody and either moved in themselves or, raised the rent to $1,500 and you were paying $750. It's a big problem. And I don't have the answers for that, because that's for people smarter than me. I just sell houses. So it is an issue. And like I say, we are hitting kind of critical mass, because, once you're getting priced out of kind of the West End and that area specifically, and, I'll throw Remington Park in there, and there's other pockets around the city too that have some lower income areas, even downtown, as you get kind of not far from my place. Once you get kind of north of Erie Street, it gets a little less desirable. It's a big problem. I don't know what you do. I don't know where they go. I think that's why we're having the conversations about housing that we are having.
Yeah.
And what's so scary? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, thanks, John. I promise I'll give you the show back in just a second. I'm having a lot of fun with this discussion, though. I think what makes this such a big problem is that property values are rising, which is great for anybody, as you said, who's sitting with property, and that the class of people who own property are doing quite well, and think Windsor's going in a great direction. But incomes at the bottom end rising the way that they should. We're about to see updated census data, so we're going to find out. Anecdotally, it doesn't feel that way to me. It doesn't feel like incomes are keeping pace with the increase in housing costs. And I think you're right. We're headed into a situation where a lot of the slack in the system that people benefited from because their incomes were lower is going away, and I don't know where that leaves us. You can have the show back now, John.
Yeah, and sorry, no, you can't, John. Just give me 1 second.
Son of a gun. I want to add to this conversation.
Okay, no, go ahead.
Go ahead.
You were going to ask a question. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say, what's concerning about it, and Donna, you'll be able to provide to this to where I want to go with it, is we're at a point right now where, I don't see a reason why, prices would start to decrease, because what you're looking at coming online right now, it's all in line with what the demand is for it, right? We already have this lack of supply, and what's being added to the stock isn't going to go and decrease things for someone else. It's not going to decrease their rents. I mean, there's all those new townhouses going up in Ward 4, right? Or no, in Ward 5, in that area just past Walker Road. And what are those going for, Don? I'm sure you've seen some prices for those.
Yeah, I mean, the new townhomes, anywhere you're seeing them. So if you're familiar with this at all, they built a whole bunch of brownstone type places right on Walker Road, on the west side of Walker Road. Now, they weren't even selling those, but they were just leasing those out. I believe they're going for about $2,700 a month, obviously plus utilities and everything else. So the conversation has been about intensification, about just building like crazy and hopefully lower income places. The only reason you're seeing the building happening now like we are is because of prices. Before, it didn't make sense to build an apartment building if you could only charge $650 for an apartment. The math just didn't work. It was plain and simple. Everything in development is a math problem. So now you're seeing like those townhomes are $2,700, but even the ones, you can pick anywhere in the city, they're all over the place. But your starting prices are generally going to be $600,000 or plus for a townhome, depending on what size it is. And, I've seen some go, $700,000, $800,000. So how does that help? It really the theory is, trickle down housing theory, is someone like me who bought my house 15 years ago, lives downtown and makes a certain income, will say, okay, I'll sell my place now that I have, $300,000 equity in it, put $300,000 down on a $600,000 house, and then someone can buy mine. And what I was going to interrupt you with Doug's points there is, look, I'm going to give you a real world example, and I'm going to use me as the example. I bought my house 16 years ago now, sorry, not 15, and I paid $109,000 for it. Right now, ballpark, I could easily sell my house for $400,000. So in 15 years, you've basically seen a quadruple of housing values. Now, the problem you run into from a perception standpoint is, if you're buying a house, someone will come in and see someone like me living here and think, well, I want a house like that. What's it going to cost me? To buy this house now is going to cost you probably on a mortgage, even a 400, we'll just use round numbers. A $400,000 mortgage is about $1,600 a month now, where Don, who bought 15 years ago, was paying $400 a month. So that's where your discrepancy comes in. So even if I leave this house and move somewhere else, somebody buying it is still going to have, $18,000, $19,000 a year in mortgage payments on top of everything else. So that's why these neighborhoods, as far as average incomes, will go up. I think you'll see I don't know if it'll be in this census or the next one, but I think you'll start to see in neighborhoods, incomes will rise in certain neighborhoods, just because the people buying those houses, for someone to qualify to buy $100,000 house, you could be working at Tim Hortons and make minimum wage. For someone to buy a $400,000 house where you got $16,000 in mortgage payments or 18 grand, you have to make kind of, a family income of $60,000, $70,000 kind of thing. So you are going to see that happen. But to go back to your point, I think, it's great we're seeing all the development going on downtown with the CIP, which I think was a great thing. Don campaigned on it in 2014. And, but again, those rental properties, they're high end. Even those ones that went up a few years ago on University and Campbell, I think it was, were over by the old Grace site. Those ones were $2,200, $2,400. So I think you see a lot more people sharing. There's, even buying houses. There was an article that came out with a client of mine in the Windsor Star when it was talking about affordability back in December, and he purchased that property, and he has a good job. He can't tell you what he does, but he makes a good income. But he was able to purchase that house because he was living with some buddies, and they're going to move in and they're going to share expenses. So I think in those apartments you're talking about, for $2,400, if you get 3 or 4 kids, friends who live together, well, now sure, it's only $600 a piece, but you got 4 kids crammed into a 2-bedroom apartment somewhere. So I think it's
Airbnbs across the city everywhere.
Well, and that's another topic. Airbnb, maybe not so much in Windsor, but in Toronto, it's a huge problem, because condo buildings are going up and investors are buying 10 units and they don't let anyone live there full time.
Well, hey, thank you for that. We've got a lot of insight there into the development angle, and of course, just before that, from the statistical and demographic side of things.
Just more reasons for people to hate me. Not only as a RCP conservative host, but also a real estate agent. He's one of those guys.
You lay it on thick for him. It's easy to go against it. Let's shift this conversation to political analysis of this, and where things are going. And if you guys would appease me so much right here, one of the things that I wanted to just start off with and see whether or not you would agree with me on this. I mean, this is a ward that has 4 BIAs in it: Wyandotte Town Center, Walkerville, Via Italia, and Ottawa Street. You have 4 neighborhood BIAs all competing for a city councillor, their time. And Lord knows it's a part-time gig. And I just wonder, from both of your perspectives, downtown, it's just the downtown BIA versus here where it's 4. How much more difficult do you think that must be, or how much more advantageous is it potentially for a councillor who's able to focus in on, some core key issues here, or do you see it to be a bit of an issue for them? Doug, start off with you.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So, the downtown BIA is huge, and it extends farther than you probably think it does, east and west and even south. And that comes with advantages and disadvantages. They have an advantage of economy of scale that I think the smaller BIAs don't have. It's one board, one membership that your counselor has to deal with. The flip side of that is I don't think there's, I don't know exactly how BIAs are constituted and why, and what it takes to define the geography of a BIA. Maybe one of our listeners who's a deeper procedural nerd than any of us might help us out and give us some answers on social media, and maybe mock Don a little while you do it. But having 4 BIAs in Ward 4 means that you don't have that economy of scale. Just at a guess, I'm guessing that the total number of businesses is probably not that different between Ward 3 and Ward 4. I don't think that Ward 4 has 4 times or even 2 times the number of businesses that Ward 3 does. So those BIAs must be smaller. I think some of them may not even have paid staff or full-time paid staff. So if it was possible to consolidate them, then it might be easier to deal with as an entity. But the flip side of that is that each of those neighborhoods, each of those districts has such a distinctive character and are so distinctly different from each other that I'm not sure you wouldn't lose that community of interest that should represent a BIA. They are acting together. They should have common interests. They should have somewhat of common problems. I imagine it makes it a lot tougher just to dealing with 4 entities versus dealing with 1. Especially if some of those 4 entities have fewer resources and smaller staff or no staff, then you're really in a tough situation because the demands and needs of businesses aren't going to change. Each individual business owner is going to have the same level of expectations of what their municipality can do for them and what their BIA can do for them. But if you're, if it's fragmented in Ward 4, and it is fragmented in Ward 4, then the reach and capability of each individual BIA is going to be weaker. Yeah, I can see how that's a problem.
Yeah, I think if you look at it, comparing Ward 3 or the downtown BIA as opposed to BIAs in Ward 4, what you run into is the BIA area, the business area is basically a let, runs north and south, whereas when you head out to Ward 4, you have different BIAs and different business areas on the major streets. So you have Ottawa, you have Wyandotte, Erie Street. So they're running east and west, so they never really intersect. So I think that's why you ended up having as many BIAs as you did, as opposed to downtown, where it's really the BIA is the heart of it is basically a Lloyd Avenue and just kind of bounces block after block after block off there for a commercial district. I think probably when you looked at going back in time, again, Walkerville was always more of an affluent area and it was its own city at one time. I'm sure most people know that. So they always had their own thing. And then you had Erie Street was obviously a very Italian area. So they had a very different type of demographic than you would have seen in Walkerville, and then you have Ottawa Street. So I think it's just because the main thoroughfares where the businesses are located really run east-west off of, if you want to use Olette as our main street in the whole city. So I think you just run into that problem. A good friend of mine, Brandy Miles, will be more than happy to mock me anytime she can. And she was, I believe she was the head of the Erie Street BIA up until recently. I think she resigned her post. But I'm sure if she hears this, she'll be more than happy to tell you what my problem is and explain the situation. But I do believe it's just because of geographic, the way things worked out. You have a bunch of little BIAs on feeder roads, which would have been Wyandotte, Erie Street, and Ottawa Street, and etc. Whereas downtown, it's it's a north and south situation, just running off the main street until you get into like university. And I guess one other point I want to make, and this again is a little bit off topic. What irritates me about Ward 4 with the way this what grinds my gears in Ward 4. No, this isn't about the people of Ward 4. When you look at how the city is handling districting of the neighborhoods in that they want to do all around the city, they've decided to start with the distillery district, or the distillery, whatever the hell they're calling, Whiskey Town, or whatever the heck they're calling it, which is really the area and the business area that needs help the least out of all of them. And I wish the city councilors and the mayor would have focused on more of your Wyandotte Street BIA or Erie Street or Ottawa Street that actually needs those neighborhoods need the help more than Walkerville do. And I think it's, I'm not going to blame Chris. I'm sure Chris has fought for, he's juggling a lot of balls down there. Whereas, as you mentioned, someone like Councilor Bordelon just has downtown really to focus on from a commercial area.
Yeah, I think it's probably a good time to point out or to remind folks, the Wyandotte Town Center a few years back, their BIA put together a pretty ambitious plan for districting that part of the city. You may remember the photographs and whatnot, and that districting plan was flatly denied. And to your point, Don, you look at the difference between the quote unquote distillery district and Wyandotte Town Center, and these are the two opposite poles in terms of the health of a neighborhood and a business district in Windsor. You would think that your investment first would land in a place like Wyandotte Town Center, or a place like Wyandotte Street West down in Ward 2. Those are the places that would benefit the most. It almost seems to me like it's looking for a quick win is more important than trying to make the biggest impact possible.
Yeah, because if you designate and put investment into Distillery District or Whiskey Town, wherever they're calling Walkerville, there's no way to lose there. I mean, the businesses are already generally successful. The area is more affluent. Walkerville has a long history, probably longer than downtown Windsor, to be honest. And so, yeah, it's a guaranteed win. Whereas if you go to, Wyandotte Street, where the Wyandotte Street BIA, who had that plan, which, if you remember correctly, was basically going to cost the city next to nothing relative to what they were paying for it themselves and just needed permission. And the mayor basically told them to, move to Walkerville, where all the cool people live, and I'll give you money there. So, yeah, it's absurd. I guess that's the nicest way I'll put it. And you can tell politics came screaming into that because, I think part of the rationalization for not doing it is we already have big plans for all this that, never happened as usual. And so, yeah, we're not going to do your plan because we have a much bigger, better plan that the city's going to get behind. And then X number of years later, we got nothing.
You can't have that much potential investment in that ward.
That's true. Yeah.
If you guys will indulge me, I want to pop this map back up because I want to make a point since we're on political analysis now. I'm just popping back up the map of the old ward system. And one thing I think that is really different between the 5 and the 10 ward system is how much political power resides in the urban core. So if my math is correct, looking at this map, wards 2, 3, and 4 in the old 5-ward system are all urban wards. Sure, the old Ward 4 extended down to the southern border of the city and Baseline Road and 9th Concession and all that stuff. But realistically, the voter base, the population base is urban. So we have moved from a situation pre-2010 when 6 out of the 10 councillors would be representing an urban ward to a situation now where 4 of the 10 councillors in the 10 ward system represent an urban ward. And I don't know enough about the way that the redistricting was done to understand if that was a choice or if it was something that just happened organically because that's where the lines landed on the map. But I think it's a really interesting topic to bring up in the context of Ward 4, because I mentioned earlier that Ward 4 is one of the 4 highest voter turnout wards. It has some of the wealthiest Windsorites. It has some of the most influential Windsorites. It has some of Windsor's most successful businesses. And that part of town is used to, I think, wielding significant political influence in the city of Windsor. Traditionally, in the 20th century, that part of the city would have had, I think, an outsized influence on what happens. But now, when you think about those 4 wards, again, the risk board and the 4 wards that are the most important for citywide races, Wards 1, Ward 6, Ward 7, and Ward 4, only one of them is urban. So the political influence in the city has moved to the periphery of the city. And you've got folks in Ward 4, especially when you think back to races like 2010 and 2014, where I think that there is an expectation that the agenda of well-to-do people in Ward 4 is the city's agenda. And I think that helps to understand the stances that Chris Holt takes, why Chris Holt was the choice of Ward 4, and why Alan Halberstad, in fact, was also a successful politician in that part of town. That is a part of town that I think is frustrated by the evolving nature of the city's sort of political scheme and setup. And I think that there are a lot of residents of Ward 4 who feel like their seat at the table has been taken away or whatnot, and have a great deal of frustration. And that's not to say that Chris Holt is the Donald Trump of Windsor, because he represents a somewhat frustrated electorate. That's not what I'm saying, although it's super funny to say, and I'm really glad that
I'm going to say it every chance I get.
But what I am saying is, when you think about where Chris is ideologically and what issues are the most important to Councillor Holt, and I'm not saying they're not important, and I'm not saying he's some crazy granola crunching nut bar. I'm not saying that at all. What I am saying, though, is that he's very offside with what is sort of the baseline Windsor political viewpoint. We've talked about how he's a unique figure in the city before, and I've talked about this a number of times. And I think my view is at least that it in part it stems from the reason that Chris and his perspectives and his approach and his style resonate as much as they do in Ward 4 is because there's a level of frustration there.
Yeah, my opinion of granola crunching Trumponian nut bar Chris Holt is pretty much the same. That's why I had to make
the thing is, this is the one show that you can guarantee the ward councilor is going to listen to, right?
Oh, 100%. That's the only reason
we got to get our licks in, Chris. Sorry,
the only reason I make fun of Chris as much as possible is I know he listens. I could talk all day about Francis and he's not going to hear what I say. But to your point about when the ward's amalgamated, I think that's why I think you're 100% correct. I think the political power, we've seen it just by, going to districts and seeing who votes where. I'll use the bulk item pickup debate that we had years ago around, kind of previous to this council. The response from, Councillor Hillary Payne at the time, well, this doesn't affect my area, so I don't care. And even if you looked at the old map that you put up there, Ward 1, it's easy for Councillor Francis or one of those outside, or Geniac or one of them to say, it's a downtown problem, I don't give a rat's ass. It's a West End problem, I don't give a rat's ass. But when you had the old maps, someone like the two councillors of Ward 1, they had to deal with that because it was part of their ward. They had no choice. So it's easy for them now to just ignore issues in the old core neighborhoods because, again, they don't have the power that they used to, because more than half the councillors don't have to deal with these problems. And unfortunately, the outside wards, outside kind of your ring of downtown areas or core areas, they vote more. And I think that's what we've run into. We've given the power to people more in the suburbs, the more affluent people. And you can even look at it over the last 20 years from an investment standpoint. We've seen in South Windsor and South Walkerville, you got new libraries, parks get updated, you got new hockey arenas like in South Windsor Arena. And what have you lost in West Windsor? You've lost the community centers, you've lost the schools down there, you've lost programs down there. They've tried a few times to get rid of 80 Knox. Now they're going to redo that, but they got rid of, the water park over by Glengarry. So, you're 100% correct. I mean, the counselors don't have to worry about downtown core problems anymore or older neighborhood problems because it isn't officially their problem. It's someone else's. And we just don't, those neighborhoods don't have the pull that they used to. And we're seeing, the negative results of that. And that's why I've always said, if you're a city councilor, you have to remember you're a city councilor for the whole city, not just your ward. And I think our counselors have become very territorial and they really only care about what happens in their ward and sometimes don't see the big picture that, if Ward 1 is doing great, but Ward 2 and 3 are having issues, the whole city kind of sucks and suffers by it. And you can't just, build a gate around your area. Although I've made many jokes about building a wall around Ward 1 and Ward 2 will pay for it. It's funny every time. And
they've got a moat, Don. They don't need a wall.
That's true. Yes. They got the big, what is it, a linear park, or are we still calling it a ditch? Anyway, so yeah, I think your point's 100% correct. And I think we've seen the negative aspects of that, that the core areas have lost investment that because, money buys votes. And if you send it to South Windsor, South Walkerville, Forest Glade, those you're going to get the votes because that's where people are voting.
Yeah, imagine if Windsor, instead of electing a mayor directly, imagine if we had an electoral college where every ward sent one representative. We elected an elector.
Ward 3 is sending an alternative slate. We're not letting you get away with this.
Right. But if we had a word by word election, if you had to win the majority of wards instead of winning the majority of the vote overall, how different this city would be. And I'm not saying that would be more fair or anything like that, but I'm simply putting it forward as a thought experiment to get folks thinking about how the system and the setup drives outcomes. Yes, it's a democracy. And yes, we have all of the representation and consultation that we see, but the way that the system is structured has a great deal to do with outcomes. And I think that the conclusion that I inescapably reach is that the system in Windsor is stacked against the urban core of the city post 2010.
Well, it absolutely is. And while you guys have been talking, I've done a read through the 2009 report put together by a gentleman of Waterloo, Ontario, Mr. Robert J. Williams, because we do love to outsource our consultants here in the city. And going through, there's multiple recommendations here about how to deal with the new ward options. He recommended a status quo with, just the biggest issue was that they say some wards were growing at different rates. So it wasn't a equal representation of, constituents per ward, which is fair. So there were 3 options given. One, which is status quo, rejig it a bit to keep 5 wards with 2 councillors in each ward, and then with the mayor. The second was what we have now, the system we have now, 10 councillors, the mayor. And then the last one was 8 councillors across 8 wards with the mayor. So obviously we went with the one in the second here, but the biggest issue they said was that came up, and it's a very lengthy report. Well, it's 32 pages, but I'm going through it quickly right now is my point. They were trying to figure out, trade-offs between population density, but they also talk about in their assessment, effective representation, communities of interest that were impacted. And then that goes further into what the actual Windsor breakup was, which was, the fact that we were so urban based with, our downtown Windsor, with Sandwich, with Walkerville, with Ford City. And the issue was that those traditional communities were overrepresented, it says, versus new neighborhoods that were coming online. So if you actually really do look at it, Doug, it's like no matter what of the three options that you choose, you're ending up with an outcome that will really shake up things, even if you got to keep those two councillors in the downtown core working for each other. It's hard to say. I would have to go look at the actual map that was proposed. So, the point being here, I'm not going to say it's a stacked deck, but I mean, when the options considered, it seems are what they were, it's hard to see how anything else could have come.
Really interesting. And I'm going to go back to use my little time machine to go back to 2009 and read some opinion columns. I bet Henderson had some really hilarious stuff to say about this. I'll report back next week.
Most interesting as well. I mean, I love it, right? We spend the money on the consultants. They're from out of town. They've got to be the best. We take their results, we use it. And then it goes on to say as well, I also recommend Windsor consider adopting a policy that ward boundaries be reviewed on a predetermined calendar. He then goes on to say, why not every 2 elections? So we are here now on the 3rd election, and maybe there's a conversation that we need to have about whether this system is in fact working. And I think there's an argument that if it's working the way that maybe the way it was designed. And this report final was June 2009 presented. And that is obviously coming in just before that 2010 election that Don was in.
I was the voice of the future, John, and they just ignored me completely. It's a terrible shame. Your dad and I would have made it completely.
You got like 14 votes, right, Don?
Yeah, well, 13 were mine. I voted a lot of times. But
imagine you and my dad having been the counselors at the time, serving the ward together. What
both
a different
of us,
Windsor.
Would have been fantastic.
Man, would have seen some real development.
And the gigs downtown would have been fabulous.
Would have been great all around. This is Rose City Politics. I'm calling it. I think I'm calling it. Yeah? Okay. I'm getting the nods here. This was our political analysis and discussion for Ward 4 Ward Watch. Hope that we got to the issues that you wanted to hear about. With these shows, we try to really just dive into it and, just give you the tools that you need to make the best assessments. It's easy to go and just present the news stories that pop up, but it doesn't give the behind the scenes stories. And so that's what we try to do, obviously, here. If there's things that we didn't get to, though, that you wanted to hear more about, we'd love to hear about that on social media. That would be ideal. Get in touch with us. But it is January 26th. This was Ward Watch 2022, Ward 4. Check us out at patreon.com/Rose City Politics. While you're on the web, check us out on social media, favorite us on any one of your podcasting apps, and Rose City Politics is able to broadcast live on tape thanks to the kind support of Leuna 625, Building Better Communities. Comment about our backgrounds as well on social media if you want as well. We'll be back next week.